Now you're welcome along to the Huddle Breakdown. We are back. It's been a long couple of weeks away for the World Cup, but Celtic are back and back to winning ways with a 1-0 win against Aberdeen at the weekend. Callum McGregor also back in action, getting the winning goal off the game. Alan Morrison is running a little bit low. He's having a few technical issues, but you are stuck until then with myself and with Jiko James as well. James, how are you? It's too early to say Happy Christmas, but it's almost that time.
Yeah, happy Toy Day. I found that out yesterday that that's what they celebrate in Japan. It's called Toy Day, and my wife was expressing aggravation as to why they get a day off work for a for something called Toy Day. So I don't know. So happy
Today's Toy
pre.
Day. Or,
No, I don't know. It's same day as Christmas. I don't know if they do it on the 25th. So, but I mean, you can wish each other a happy Toy Day because no one knows what the hell it is anyway.
Okay, I will do that when it is eventually Toy Day, Christmas Day or otherwise. Look, it's been a long couple of weeks. World Cup was obviously very entertaining and kept us busy for the last number of weeks, and it almost feels weird that we're sitting here talking about a club match, especially a Celtic match that went on Saturday while the fourth playoff was played again. Croatia and Morocco playing that in the World Cup, while Celtic were in Pittodrie playing against Aberdeen. It was a long game. It was a game that Celtic dominated. It was a game that Celtic dominated all of the ball essentially, and it was a game that Celtic eventually come up on top, and they're still top of the table despite Michael Beale and the Brown Brogues and the new suits. Despite all that they could do, Celtic are still top of the league.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, Alan and I discussed quite a bit of the game on Sunday when we did the Axom hour for the charity weekend. And yeah, are you going to fill us in on where you're at? I mean, I speculated on that show. I had heard that you were at an effective altruism retreat on Saturday and then a Scientology retreat on Sunday. But I don't know. Was that accurate? Is that where you were at?
Not quite. I've moved into a new apartment, and as people can see,
Okay.
I'm still getting settled in. So I'm still currently working off a hotspot. So I didn't want to chance doing such a big weekend. So I left it in your trusting hands.
Okay. Well, thank you for clarifying that because we don't want that kind of scuttlebutt getting around. So yeah, it was one of those. It was weird because we had the break and it shouldn't feel like one of those December games. um, when the fixture list piles up, and we kind of talked about that before the break and how that November period had started to kind of feel that way as performances kind of got lethargic and some nervy games there where it could have went into the area of dropping some points. So we didn't really play that way on Saturday, but it kind of felt that way because of how close the game was from a results perspective, even though we, completely dominated things in possession and really controlling the game. So yeah, Al and I discussed it on Sunday. It's actually a lot of elements that were fascinating, and I've been, it's made me chuckle how much heat Goodwin has taken. I subscribe to Graham Spears' podcast, his Patreon, and I haven't listened to it yet, but just the show notes I saw it dropped into my podcast feed. He had two Aberdeen people on to talk about this, this war crime of tactics that Goodwin deployed on Saturday. So yeah, that's been funny and fascinating to watch. As if he's done some kind of heretical thing. But yeah, it was good to be able to not drop the points in a game that you dominate to that degree.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we'll see if we can continue that tomorrow. Certainly shouldn't be as difficult of a challenge, but we shall see.
Well, Jim Goodwin mentioned or hinted towards trying to take some inspiration from St. Mirren and their win against Celtic earlier on this season. And it was a bad copycat system, essentially, that he tried to put out. It was the St. Mirren game tactics without doing all the good elements of it, essentially, is what Aberdeen did. I think what disappoints me the most is that I have no doubt that Jim Goodwin is actually a good manager and is capable of a lot more. And Aberdeen are the third, if like fourth, if not third, biggest club in Scotland. You don't need you should not be playing the same tactics as a St. Mirren side, because that's not who you are. That's not how you should act. And I think I'm not here sitting here saying that they should have opened the gates and let Celtic run through them, but show a little bit of respectability for yourself and the club, that the position that you're in, and try win the game rather than just going out and hoping to nick a same result as St. Mirren, who are at best a mid-table side.
Yeah, so I think this is fertile area for conversation. And this what I find most interesting, as I mentioned, is I think that the severity of the criticism that he's gotten is kind of disproportionate to what I think is a reasonable decision. I mean, I think reasonable people can disagree, right? So I think what you just expressed is reasonable. I don't think that that's like a crazy perspective to have or anything even close to that. But I also don't think that a club of Aberdeen's resources relative to ours, and particularly the way that we're performing under Ange, that it's crazy that they would look to mimic, or at least try to mimic, what another team has done to achieve some success. And I wrote a column this week, as it hasn't been published yet, but so I did a deep dive on that St. Mirren game, and I compared a lot of it to the game on Saturday. And what's interesting, so do you happen to remember how St. Mirren scored that game? They had their two goals.
Top of my head, no.
Yeah. So I had neither, right? So I mean, you can't usually, especially as you're getting old and decrepit like I am, it's hard to I've killed too much gray matter in the brain. So I don't have the memory on that kind of stuff anymore. So I went back and looked. So the first goal was kind of a fortunate bounce that deflected, I think, off of Starfelt and went wide. Or maybe it was Moy, I forget, but it deflected off one of our people and went wide to their winger, who then did put in a nice cross ball into the back post. And I think one of their midfielders or defenders even ran onto it and headed it, right?
Yes, I remember that one. Yeah.
Right. So that was their only shot from open play, quote unquote. And it was facilitated by a lucky bounce. And the second goal was a long throw in, where there was 4 consecutive headers, one of which was from one of our guys in the box, that ended up over to one of their guys who headed it in, right? So hardly 2 examples of, repeatable, consistent scoring opportunities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Outside of that, so again, and then the parallel I drew when I looked through this game from Saturday is Aberdeen had a really good chance off of a Starfelt header, right? So Roos had a long goal kick. Starfelt, for some reason, headed it towards the center of the pitch. As I joked with Alan on Sunday, the Duck of Death collected the ball and then played a nice ball. I think his name's Lopez, actually. I shouldn't be too disrespectful. I think his name's Lopez. But Lopez sprayed the ball wide to Kennedy, who had a nice 1v1 against Taylor, drew Hatate over, and one of his teammates was wide open right at the 18-yard line at the top of the box. If he just fed him a pass, that would have probably been a pretty decent scoring chance. Instead, he decides to putz around with the ball and loses it to Taylor, right? So my point is that when you get into these kind of games, if you're going to play that way, you need to capitalize on the relatively small number of chances that you're going to get. And their set piece that they had from like 25 yards, the kid they have on loan from, I forget where, Brentford or something, I don't know. He took it and ballooned it over the crossbar, not even really that close, right? So again, from a game state perspective, they kind of had very similar output to St. Mirren in that regard, right? Mm-hmm. They really only had a couple of chances. St. Mirren happened to score on both of theirs with, some variability in there that's pretty favorable. Aberdeen weren't able to replicate that. And then if you look at the chance creation that Celtic had, and I agree with you, Goodwin didn't really replicate, or at least Aberdeen weren't able to replicate what St. Mirren did. Now, how much of that was us imposing on them and not enabling them to do it versus manager instructions? But one thing that was notable is that they were about 5 to 10 yards deeper, so their average line was further into their box than what St. Mirren was able to do. And St. Mirren in that game were far more aggressive in attacking. So when we were in possession in that game, they kind of pounced on us at a rate that was about 40% higher. There's a metric for that. So within it's something called aggression. It's basically when the opposing team gets possession or makes a pass. How many times does the opposing the defenders engage them within 2 seconds, right? And St. Mirren did that at a 40% higher rate than what Aberdeen did. So they were, 5 to 10 yards further up, and they were attacking more aggressively. And what that manifested in is we had a ton of shots from outside the box against Aberdeen. One of them that ended up being the winning goal. I think it was like 15 shots or something like that. Whereas against St. Mirren, they were patrolling that area a lot more aggressively, and we didn't get nearly the volume of shots off from that area. Inside 18 yards is pretty comparable actually in the game. So as I said to Alan on Sunday, I actually think it was an execution problem more than a game plan problem. And if they actually did a better job of it, I think it's actually a reasonable way for a team like Aberdeen to pursue playing against us because of how dominant we are right now under Ange. You're muted.
Sorry, that's what I meant by a bad copycat system. Was
Yeah.
that they tried to do the same as St. Mirren, but they did it pretty badly. It was 18 shots from outside the box, 15 shots from inside the box for Celtic. And at this point in time, I'm going to bring in Alan Morrison, who is waiting in the background because he has got his computer to work. Alan, how are you getting on?
I'm all right. I've got no keyboard at all. The keyboard does not work. So I think I do have to do it by mouse, unfortunately. Anyway, sorry about that.
I thought maybe you had an advanced, since you're a computer guy, I thought maybe you had an advanced like mind control function that we don't get us layman's.
Yes. No, a bit. Not that I can execute with like a minute's notice. So I'm supposed to be doing this. Anyway.
Look, it's all good. We're all here now. And I want to jump in on something that James was talking about there, Alan. I think you were listening in the background about how deep Aberdeen were sitting, because it's not always about what they're trying to do. It's sometimes what they're able to do. And I think a lot of that comes down to how Celtic were playing and how dominant they were. And most importantly, the return of Callum McGregor into the midfield of Celtic, because what that does is that gives you a natural anchor as a number 6. Matt O'Reilly pushes up forward, Atate pushes up forward, and suddenly Celtic have you pinned in at the edge of your box. So just quickly before I bring you in on this, somebody in the comments mentioned that Callum McGregor had more passes than the entire Aberdeen team, which is true. Aberdeen had 119 completed passes in this game to Callum McGregor's 170. So I think it's fair to say, Alan, that Callum McGregor is back.
Well, yes, he is. And I mean, in fact, he had more than double the number of completed passes that he's had in any game this season. But therein lies the tale, right? So this was a game which was another sticky game for Celtic. I think from what I picked up, because I only picked the tail end of what James was speaking about, but he was comparing it to the St. Mirren game, and actually, to an extent, and this is probably what you've already covered, to an extent, Goodwin was very successful in replicating that performance on Aberdeen's behalf in terms of that St. Mirren game, because if you look at some of the key metrics, just did manage to pull these together before the thing, in terms of our pass completion was really high. Now, you think pass completion, again, I talk about putting risk into your passes. A really high pass completion, we've had that. We've had an equivalent pass completion in 5 games this season, 6 games this season. One of them was the 9-0 Dundee United game. Put that to one side. All the others were games where it was an absolute struggle. right? So just moving from 86 to 87% pass completion to 89, 90% pass completion doesn't sound a lot, but that moves the dial from, being aggressive with your passing to being pedantic. At 1 or 2%, that's all it seems to take to push you into that territory. Okay, it's fascinating how close, small that margin is. The four games we had nearly 100 passes more than any other game this season, and the two next. And again, let's remove the Dundee United 9-0 from the table. The next two highest passes were the 4-2 Dundee United game where we had to score twice in the last few minutes, and the loss to St Mirren, right? And our total packing score was one of the lowest of the season, which equates to games against Real Madrid, Shakhtar, the 4-3 against Hearts, the 2-1 battle against St Johnstone, the loss to Leipzig, the loss to St Mirren, and the two games of Ross County where we tend to struggle. We had the most shots of any game this season. We had the most touches in the box, but crucially, we had the lowest expected goals per shot of any game this season, and that's the crucial point. So you look at it and you think 33 shots, that's amazing. 52 touches in the box, fantastic. But if you're less than 10 xG per shot, all you're doing is accumulating volume, and you're just making your stats look. Some of your stats look good, but actually you're not creating good chances, and that's the problem. So all of that is to say that Aberdeen, to a point, did very well. That point was, and I think you probably covered it, James, is that unlike St Mirren, what St Mirren had was two strikers who were able to battle for every aerial ball and win a lot of them, and were able to therefore get their team up the pitch because either they got a free kick or they got a throw in and halfway or something, and then it was a case of launching a throw in from there, etc. And they also had three very energetic midfielders that ran their guts out, as well as their wing backs actually on the day, who supported those strikers. There was just such an enormous gap between Aberdeen's 8 and their 2. But you did end up, and so some of these stats are a function of having this incredible game where Celtic, there's almost two matches going on. There's 8v8 in one end of the pitch, and there's 2v2 in the other end of the pitch. It's quite fascinating. It was two completely separate contests were going on at exactly the same time, and their delivery, obviously, they were just relying on a fortunate long ball, and then one of their strikers, neither of whom looked like they were geared for winning aerial battles to win it. But so I think they completely, Goodwin tried to replicate it. It was actually very successful up to a point. And again, a lot of the negative response to him has been because of the outcome. They lost. But if they'd drawn 0-0, I'm sure there would have been a lot of plaudits coming his way, right? And they were only 7 minutes away from that. So those are the margins, really. And you mentioned Callum McGregor, right? So let's talk about Callum McGregor. So yeah, absolutely incredible. And what I'm about to say isn't any harm to anyone, because what you need to do when you're faced with a situation where you've got 8 players behind the ball is obviously you need to have a lot of selfless running off the ball, and you need to be diligent and patient in creating your overloads and working for those spaces. And I'm not saying we were bad at that. I don't think we were. But what we got into a pattern, and that pattern was Ralston to McGregor to Taylor to McGregor to Ralston. If you look at the passing maps, it's this little triangle, little sort of alleyway outside the box, and those three were kind of passing. Now, best will in the world, Taylor, and I know Ralston played the best pass of the game, exception, but when Callum McGregor is making 170 passes and Jota's making 26, you've got a problem. Okay, that's not the right ratio. 20% of all actions on the pitch were Callum McGregor. Right now, Callum McGregor is taking responsibility. You could say Callum McGregor is being a captain. He's being a leader. He's being the glue. He's trying to drive the team forward. But something that's not functioning properly. If you cannot get your creative players on the ball and in the game, then you're something wrong with what you're doing. Okay, and this comes down to really just obviously some of the risks associated with the way we play. So one of the things that I've been kind of getting interested in the break is there's a bit of a debate going on in. Sorry, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but obviously explosion in football analysis and in football data and so forth, right? and that is quite a big landscape now, and it covers on all sorts of different people that do all sorts of different things. One extreme over here would be the guy that simply posts the XG from every game as if that's a magic bullet that says that XG explains the whole game, right? And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got people that think that football is to be treated like some medieval scrolls discovered in a Tibetan cave, and that you must, undertake some existentialist and very, very academically rigorous assessment of every game to fully understand what went on. And then in the middle is the rest of us, and so on and so forth. But one of the things that's coming out of this sort of more, let's call it academic, amongst the academic disciples of the game, is this notion of positionism versus relationism. All those of you that remember your A levels and your degrees, everything has to be grounded in an ism. You must remember all these topics that you used to do at college where you thought, this is going to be really interesting. And then they make it as boring as they possibly can, because you have to learn all this theory and all these frameworks and all the theory that goes behind before you can get to the juicy stuff. So just bear with me on this one. But so essentially, what are these things? So positionism is essentially, I would call it a dominant orthodoxy in football in where we are today. And what would be an example of that? The most extreme example would be Manchester City and Pep Guardiola, where essentially on the training pitch, he divides the pitch up into quadrants, and they rehearse moves to ensure that there's not more than 3 people in any lane or what have you in any vertical or horizontal, and that they're trying to get people into positions accordingly. They're a very highly structured, well rehearsed. But within that, the players do have to make a lot of complex decisions. I'm not saying you're creating robots. You do have to make a lot of decisions within that, but it's based around positioning on the field to try and manipulate the opposition. And Postecoglou is a disciple of this style of football, and that's what Celtic play. Okay, what's the other? So relationism. So two good examples from recent experience would be, one would be Croatia, right? So if you look at Croatia, listen, everything's within a structure. Nothing's completely, if you wanted to take relationism to its absolute sort of fundamental extreme for the sake of building a model, you would say, give a ball to a bunch of kids that never played football before and send them out into the street, and it would just be like chaos. They'd all be running around after the ball. That's like one extreme, right? Versus the other extreme would be, imagine Louis van Gaal, was given infinite time to create the perfect sort of, robotic team of people that every single thing they do is rehearsed. And that would be the kind of other extreme of it. Something like Croatia has a framework. They've got high wingers. The fullbacks stay wide, but the midfielders and the striker, who's not really a striker, they are free to do pretty much what they want to do to exploit any space they can find and to manipulate the opposition around the pitch. Because they've got 3 excellent, intelligent midfielders, and they've got a striker who's not really a striker that kind of helps them create these overloads. Another good example was the World Cup final. I mean, this is what Scaloni did, right? He was up against a disciple of positionism in Deschamps. Deschamps is, and this is a lot to do with, we're now at an age where we've had years and years and years of academy-trained kids who are all learning much the same thing. They're all learning to play positional football. They're all learning the same disciplines, the same ways to press, the same ways to defend, and so forth, and so on and so forth. And France is probably at the head of the curve. Anyone in the globe, they've got the more players that can do this stuff than anybody else, right? And so what Scaloni did was, again, he had a structure. He had fullbacks didn't go very far. He kept Di Maria wide, and then the rest of them basically exploited the spaces that they knew would be there because Mbappe wasn't going to track back, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the point I'm trying to make is that you have to find a way to because this is all on a spectrum, right? There's nobody that's a 100% pure one model or the other here. Everyone's on a spectrum of the extent to which you're, let's call it, rigid in your positioning and in your movements. And like Celtic weren't rigid on Saturday, because how often have we seen Taylor and Ralston that high? No, we have. That was quite a kind of, that was them responding to their situation, but we ended up with the wrong players on the ball all the time. Because if you want creative passing, you don't necessarily want McGregor, Ralston, and Taylor on the ball. So sorry, very long-winded, but it's just something that I've been thinking about. I'm not saying I've got the answer, but what Celtic need to do is just in those moments and in those games is to find have different tools in their box, if you like. At the moment, the tools in our box are, well, we'll just bring on Turnbull and Giacomakis and Abada. And that's great. And that's going to probably win 75% of games in Scotland, just simply overpowering teams like that. But the thing that I'm concerned about is that's 2 games in a row now. We've had pretty much similar performances. I know it's a month ago since we had the Ross County game where we won at home, but essentially the underlying data was very, very similar. We played a low block and we struggled to break it down, and we might be able to brute force it. And that's essentially what we did. It's brute force. It's you just keep doing what you're doing, and eventually greater quality will tell, and something will fall for you. I just think if we're going to develop as a football club, then we just need to start thinking about. I don't want to call it Plan B. I just mean having different strategies in place, different patterns in place to cope with these sort of things. This is high-end stuff. I'm not talking about fundamental problems here that it's panicking. I'm talking about really high-end stuff here. I'm talking about turning 2 or 3 draws in a season into wins, right? Mm-hmm. But if we want to be the best version of ourselves, these are the things that we need to be looking at, because the evidence to me is there. This is increasingly becoming the way that we're performing. Because the danger with saying, which is the way we're going to play, we're always going to play that way, is of course it's predictable. And the worst thing about attacking football is being predictable. It's great when you're defending, that's fantastic, but you can't have predictability in your attack.
Can I offer a slightly shorter solution? Because we spoke about this at a similar enough stage of last season, and there was a game, I can't remember which one it was, but I think it might have been Ross County or someone of that ilk, and we had something in the line of 26 crosses in the game. We just kept putting crosses into the box. That's all we could do, because similar enough, Ralston was too far up, Greg Taylor was too far up. Everyone was in the final third of the opposition, and nobody had any space to do anything other than cross the ball. This is a similar vein to that. We were so far up that all we did was shoot in bad positions that we normally wouldn't do. But for me, it's as simple as bringing everyone back 5 yards, bringing your defenders back 5 yards onto the halfway line. Callum McGregor taking a 5-yard step back towards the defenders, opening up space in front of them, getting Taylor and Ralston back a little bit further, and getting Matt O'Reilly to do the overload in the right-hand corner and Hatate to do the overload on the left-hand corner instead of the fullbacks. And then that's the reason we have an inverted fullback system, isn't it? Because we're able to push our midfielders out wide and then bring our fullbacks into the middle to keep the numbers on par there. So I think it'll come. I still do struggle, though, to be too critical of this performance, James, given that Celtic had still a differential of XG of like 2.3 in this game, completely dominated it. And I guess if we drew 0-0, you're saying something different, but they didn't.
Yeah, so I largely agree with Alan in that, and again, Alan wasn't on yet when I said this. I did a deep dive on some of this for a column this week, and kind of the conclusion of my column was, long live the overreaction to Goodwin's tactics. Meaning that this firestorm that he's under, hopefully creates an incentive or a disincentive structure for other teams' managers to say, "Hey, I don't want to be putting up with that." Because I agree with Alan that, and I've said this repeatedly, really, since quote unquote Ange Ball arrived, is maybe a sucker punch of high press early so you can maybe steal a mistake and a goal. But other than that, the way that I get more concerned for dropping points is when teams do park the bus. I welcome when teams like Motherwell come out and try to do a mid block and create pressure, because the exact reason that you're mentioning, Enda, as soon as teams come out and allow us to have that space in between the lines, that's how we basically hang 3, 4, 5 goals on these teams. And so the conclusion of my article was basically, my analysis is, if I'm an Aberdeen even, and this is where I think the, people say, well, they're the third biggest team, or, Hearts or Hibs. If you look back through the history of them being able to score, more than 2 goals against us and get a result. It is not very common. And when you open up and allow this Celtic iteration to have the amount of chances that greatly increases the probability of scoring more than 2 goals, a 0-0 draw is probably your best chance of getting a result. Now, that is completely antithetical to anything any of us want to watch on a week-to-week basis, right? And it's a horrible product, an entertainment product. I get that. But if you're a manager who is trying to get into a European spot, and every last point is going to help in that regards, and you play Celtic 3, maybe 4 times a season in the league, and I've watched a fair bit of Aberdeen this season, and they're not doing this against Motherwell, right? They're not playing like France was setting up defensive to a large degree, no matter who they played in the World Cup. You get certain styles of managers that they're going to, like Simeone at Atletico Madrid, like they're never going to be a dominant on the front foot kind of style. So it's not as if Goodwin's deploying that kind of cynical defensive football on a week-to-week basis. And I don't think it's unreasonable in the 4 games a season that if he thinks he can get 2 or 4 points playing that way, whereas look at the track record of Aberdeen. I mean, when Aberdeen had, a much better side of talent, guys who have gone on to play at much higher levels in the Championship and even in the Premier League. Look at the team that played against that gave us a good battle in the Cup final in 16-17 with the glorious Rogic goal. They had pretty good players. Like that was the golden era of Aberdeen talent. And how many points did they get off of us? Playing a more, they weren't playing a supremely defensive style of play. And they had a hard time getting any points off of us. So we've talked about this domestically. This team is performing at a higher level than that Invincible team. Aberdeen has less talent. And why would they expect to be able to win a 2-1 game or a 3-2 game again, or draw 2-2 or 3? I mean, to me, it's just not a high probability decision for them. I love that they're getting hammered and that, Graham Spears is having people on to slaughter their manager. Because hopefully that makes, these other managers say, yeah, why would I do this? I'd rather lose 4-0 and get called naive than get, drawn and quartered, which is what's been happening to Goodwin this week.
Yeah. February 2016, from what I can see, was the last time that Aberdeen beat Celtic. So it's been a long time. Yeah.
That was under Dyla. I think that was under Dyla.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll park the Aberdeen style of play.
So I was going to say the mistake he made was that his best chance of winning, unfortunately, was to get the ball forward to his strikers, because they're really good. By SPFL standards, they're actually really good. Unlike St Mirren's, who are hard-working players and up for the fight, but not necessarily going to score you many goals. Alan, but he got close. Again, he got people look at outcomes, right? They look at outcomes, and people.
It's interesting. It's interesting because I think the quality of the strikers was to their detriment, meaning that, to your point, the way that St. Mirren was able to create any hassle when they did, and this is actually reflected in the pass OBV metric for the game. St. Mirren, who does not have better players, had quadruple the pass OBV, and that's because they were able to lob the ball up to those 2 big lumps up front, and they were able to get some of those balls. Whereas when Aberdeen were doing it, I mean, we just mopped it up. It was a stroll in the park for Starfelt and CCV. So maybe they need to get Cosgrove back and another hammer thrower in just for that game.
just to play us. Yeah.
Let's park the Aberdeen style of play for now and concentrate a little bit more on what Celtic could do or could have done differently. We were spoken about variety in the attack and sort of changing things up a little bit. I saw a lot of people on Twitter talking about Giakoumakis and how he should definitely be on the pitch for a bit of variety in the game. And I think that was coming from Kyogo's misses. He had a couple of reasonable chances, let's say. to score, and on first glance, you're probably saying, yeah, Giakoumakis probably does take that chance. So I thought it would be interesting to set you a little task before this podcast, and that was to find out if Kyogo is missing more chances this season than he was last season, because I think there's definitely that little bit of narrative building around Kyogo this season that he's not quite where he was last year, despite his goal numbers at least matching up relatively close. James, this is a complicated one. So explain to us these numbers, because this is the beauty of football and the weirdness of it, and sort of the quirkiness of how football can work sometimes.
Yeah, so I did this quickly because the producer for the show dropped this right before we went on air.
It was
so
about 10 minutes before the game.
Yeah, apologize for that. So Alan might have some better data as far as complete through Europe and those games. But if you just look at the league games, so for Kyogo last season was about 14 90-minute equivalents. This season's just under 10. So his XG is actually up this season from 77.77 to 0.84. So he's actually, and that's also reflected by the team's overall XG creation is up, right? So we're creating more chances as a team. His proportionality has remained about stable. His finishing, so if you look at his, the quality of the shots relative to the quality of the chances, he overperformed last season. And again, these things tend to mean revert to a degree. And this season, he's underperforming by about 10% both ways. So he overperformed by 10%. Now he's underperforming. The irony of that is that his goal scoring rate is up this season, right? So he's scoring more on higher amounts of chances with worse finishing. Well, how does that happen? Well, this is the great, I wrote something on this a couple of weeks back. This is the great factor that teams can't control, which is how good is the opposition keeper playing. So Celtic have faced really bad keeper play this season. Not that the keepers all themselves have been terrible. It's just the sequencing and the games and just the randomness that's taken place. We happen to have caught a lot of guys on bad days. Let's put it that way, where their performance, and some of that's probably because they're facing us and, we're putting pressure on them, that kind of thing. But so when you mix up, that all kind of shakes out. Ironically, Giakoumakis's data is kind of similar, not exactly with the same proportionality. I mean, his finishing was better last season. It's not quite as good this season, and opposition keepers have been terrible. So I again, the sample sizes here aren't huge. I don't see much evidence that outside of some obvious aerial advantages that Giakoumakis is going to have, I don't see a lot of evidence that he's some kind of inherently better finisher in kind of the broad spectrum of chances. So it's just kind of ripe for confirmation bias, and people that like Kyogo are going to point to his, and people that prefer Giakoumakis are going to point to his, I think. So that's kind of how the data falls out and how I've kind of thinking about it at this point.
Yeah, Alan, I think a lot of this might come down to the strengths and weaknesses of both strikers and the perception of both of them, because I guess if you're playing against a team that plays really deep, you're not getting the absolute quality of Kyogo's movement in behind. He's not really stretching the defense. He's not getting in behind them with his movement, because there is no space in behind them to get behind in the first place. And then Giakoumakis is an in-the-box striker who thrives on one-touch finishes. So that's probably where this idea that, Giakoumakis is the player for these games is coming from.
Yeah, I mean, so as James said, I've got data for all the games this season, and exactly as James says, his goal scoring rate is actually a little bit down, 0.83 last season, 0.75 this, but his XG has gone up quite a lot, 0.67 last season, 0.89 this season. So this is, to me, this is a classic case of outcome perception bias. People are forming their opinions that he's performing worse because of looking at the outcomes. And yes, he's missed more, but he overperformed last season and he's slightly underperforming this season. And as James said, that can be for a variety of reasons. of which luck is is a huge part of it, frankly. So I'm not personally worried. We can talk about, is he as sharp as he was before he was injured, and that's probably a debate that's worth having. But I don't know what the evidence would be, because I can only look at his striking data, and he's actually getting more shots off this season. He's getting more shots in the box. He's getting more big chances this season than he did last season. So to me, those are all positives, and it all suggests, if we continue, and those are not positives just because of performance in Kyogo. They're positive because the team is actually performing generally better than it is last season. The way to improve breaking down an 8-man block isn't to talk about Giakoumakis or Kyogo. It's to talk about the people that are providing the chances, because Giakoumakis and Kyogo will have 3 or 4 shots in a game, whereas the creators will have 10, 12 attempts to cross a ball, pass a ball, more than that probably, in terms of through balls and so forth. So that's the key. That's the key to it. It's getting the right people on the ball. So, for example, on Saturday, it should have been a case of Ralston and Taylor doing the donkey work, pulling players out of position, which Taylor did do for the goal, and it should have been O'Reilly and Hattati getting on the ball, and then identifying when those little gaps appeared. So that's just a matter of we weren't organised on the ball properly, really. And they're the little things I'm talking about that will help improve us. Giakoumakis, the way that the team is playing, and I come back to this sort of positionism point, is we play to fairly structured patterns, and the strikers are almost interchangeable, even though they're physically and stylistically very different. The numbers are very similar because of the overpowering power of the structure of the system, if you want to call it that way. Not to say you would just drop anybody in there. Both players are suited to playing this way, and any striker that Celtic have would have to be similarly so. That isn't the problem. Both strikers are miles ahead of anyone else in the league in terms of XG. It's not even close. So it's about the chance quality creation dropping off in these circumstances, and that's what we have to address. Not which striker you have on the pitch, is my view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the only other major differentiator that I can see so far, because I agree with everything Alan just said there, is that the average chance that Kyogo's getting is significantly higher. So and again, this is just league, and again, since Europe's done, I think that's not such a bad thing to focus on, is the domestic aspect of it. But so he's averaging 0.23 XG per shot, whereas Giakoumakis is 0.17, which is still good, but that just, Kyogo's is like point.
That's
if you're going to average 0.323 per shot, that's an insane level for a striker. Like that's what Lewandowski, and like that's obviously different level of competition. But the top strikers in the best leagues, that Mbappe, that's where you're getting into that mid 0.25 area, mid 20s, and so that to me, again, and we've had this conversation before, I think Kyogo is the one that definitely has that kind of extra level of capability. Now, the other thing that is, I don't know if Alan, you have this in your data, but the one thing that has dropped significantly for Kyogo is his involvement in chance creation. And that he's actually come down to kind of where Giakoumakis is. Whereas last season, now some of that was because he was playing on the wing a little bit, so there's a little bit of that. But his involvement in his utilization is very much as a pure striker this season so far, similar to Giakoumakis. So he's not really getting involved in build up in any significant way, or So again, back to Alan's point, is that a tweak that could happen against these low blocks, meaning that if they're just kind of staying in between the center backs when against these park the bus defenses, with a little bit more movement of him dropping, because he is capable. Like, I wouldn't want Giakoumakis doing that, but I think to a degree, Kyogo could be a little bit more dynamic and interchanging with some of the other forwards, and so whether the patterns of play could be tweaked when we face, still maintaining the principles and all of that. But, that would be something, because right now it's not like that. I think that is a difference versus last season.
Yeah, I think one of the adjustments that we're going to have to make, since we were spending the last 3 weeks watching nonstop unpredictable World Cup football, is getting back to predictable football and readjusting to the idea that club football isn't as much about moments as international knockout football is, and individual moments tend to win games in the World Cup. If you just look at the World Cup final, it was probably 4 or 5 brilliant moments as opposed to a 120 minutes of anything resembling predictability. And that's what we're probably adjusting to now, is that Celtic are going to need somebody who could do it, like Haksabanovic, who is returning for the game against Livingston tomorrow. And it's Jota as well. I think that's where we're talking about the sort of the interchangeability of these systems, that you still get to a point in the game where you need someone to do something different if the normal stuff is not working. And that's why I think Jota is such an important player for Celtic, is that he's capable of doing that. He's capable of saying, okay, we've tried the back pass across to the midfield, switching the play, coming back around the corner. We've tried that 3 or 4 times. I'm going to get the ball and I'm going to dribble and I'm going to see if I can get past these players. Haksabanovic can do that. Jota can do that. Abada can kind of do that, but not really as much as the other two.
That's actually something I was going to point out, is that because Aberdeen came out and played like St. Mirren, Maeda almost became useless, meaning that they were not even pretending to try and play the ball out from the back, where his pressing value would have become more important. So what we were left with was him playing wide against a team that was just leaving us out there with our overloads, and that's not his strength. That kind of triangle ticky-tacky breaking down a bunkered defense. And I thought you saw quite a bit of difference once Abada came on, as far as the dynamism, and you got Ralston overlapping a little bit on a couple of occasions. So again, that would be a tweak that we may not have known that, or set up with the anticipation that Aberdeen were going to play that defensive. And there was a substitution to address it at a certain point. But that's my other pet peeve, which is, if it's not working, make the substitution quick, which doesn't happen in football.
Yeah. It died. The game, about this 55th minute, actually, we stopped. We had a flurry. I was just after the big chance that Kyogo missed. For 10 minutes, we didn't have a shot, and we stopped breaking the lines as well. But we didn't make the substitutions until the 71st minute. To me, that again, I'm nitpicking, but these are the small margins you need to pick at to become a better football team. I would say we're 5 to 8 minutes too late making substitutions. That momentum, halt. The momentum had shuddered to a halt, from the 55th minute. But the 65th minute was blindingly obvious, and the changes eventually came in the 72nd minute. So to me, get on that, be very attuned to that, and get on top of it. But you're absolutely right what you said, Enda. What was lacking? I mean, I shocked James on Sunday because I talked about long shots and lumping balls in. What I really meant was you just needed to create some chaos. We needed to create some chaos. It was just far too predictable, and chaos because
the goal came from
panicked
James Forrest
when the ball
as well.
When the ball flashed across the goal, you got somebody like Kyogo. He's going to react quicker than anyone else. Matt Riley is going to see it happening before anybody else. So just add a bit of something different. Like I think like you said, whether it's a Jota dribble or and that's why Abada was so effective. He completely changed the game in that regard. He ran at them and just flashed the ball across the goal. It wasn't particularly extravagant, but it just caused. Maeda's not got that in him.
we had a great case study on Sunday of the culture of football, meaning that Deschamps clearly, to Alan's point, the opposing manager comes out with a game plan that makes you look like an ass, which Argentina did for the first half.
For 80 minutes.
And right. And I mean, how many times I watched different coverage, all these podcasts I listened to, and how much was talked about, I can't believe they took Giroud and, particularly Giroud, but Dembele off that fast. It's so embarrassing for them. They took him off in the first half. It's like, this is the World Cup final. Like, you can take your feelings and shove them up where the sun don't shine. You know what I mean? It's like he had to make a change. He did make a change. I give him credit for doing it when he did. And to me, that's, generally speaking, if you're a manager that comes out and you say, oh, you know what, I'm surprised the opposition came out and set up a different way and they're playing a different way than I anticipated. Why wait until the 70th minute or the 60th minute? Because you're going to hurt their feelings. Yeah, exactly.
No, I mean, the only reason France got back into the game was because Deschamps loosened his position as principals, and he had a never-ending supply of incredibly talented young athletic players that he could continually be throwing onto the pitch. And then, lo and behold, exactly as you predicted, Argentina's hyper-aggressive, emotional centre-backs started making mistakes. And lo and behold, they scored 2 goals in the last 10 minutes. But prior to that, as he was playing in this very highly structured, very predictable way, Argentina had absolutely bamboozled them.
Mm-hmm. Well, just to finish up on this point, and some might say it's not Ange's way to do that. It's not his way to change up the style. If the high septum of pure football with the Netherlands in Louis van Gaal can put a big man up front and lump balls into the box just to create a bit of chaos, then Ange Postecoglou can do so as well. And I am not adverse to sticking Cameron Carter-Vickers into the box if we're chasing the game. And I don't think we're actually afraid of that, because if you think back to Ralston's goal last season in the 94th, 95th minute, it's a header at the back post. He shouldn't be in there, but he is in there. And it was just pure chaos, and he just managed to get his head on it. So, I mean, like, if Celtic are chasing the game, if it's still 0-0, if still deadlock, lump the ball into the fucking box. I'm happy enough to do so. We might need to do that tomorrow night. Hopefully, we won't need to do that tomorrow night against Livingston. Probably not the team to lump balls into the box against, especially if you're early on in the game. Maybe if we're chasing the game with 5 minutes to go. But can we see it being another stalemate like this? It's at home, so not as scary as potentially going to the macaroni.
I would expect. I mean, again, they have a striker that can hold the ball up. Guy does a pretty. I forget his name. I don't know.
And we're talking about chaos. He's fucking chaotic too.
Nubly,
right? I mean,
Nubly.
Yeah, that's right. Nubly.
Well, he's very creative. He barely scores, but he creates a lot. Yeah.
For Livingston, I think he's just a
bull in a
terrific
china
player. Shop. Yeah, again, I've drawn this analogy before. He reminds me of DK that played at Barnsley, who's he's had a cup of tea for the American national team, because they're like, oh, he's scoring a lot of goals in the championship, let's bring him in, and they realize this guy can barely play football. Like, he's just a battle.
Welcome to Barnsley.
Yeah, exactly. He's a battle axe that goes up into the middle in these long balls and creates chaos, and so yeah, if they play that way, which I suspect they will. Now, they've actually not completely bunkered at times. Like, they've mixed it up a little bit and been a little bit more aggressive in coming out the press and kind of the mid-block in different games, even at Celtic Park. So, but they've given us some game. And I don't, other than Martindale at Livingston, I wanted to raise this question. It just reminded me, what manager, kind of in the Rodgers forward era, gave us the most hassle? Like, who's the single manager that gave Celtic at a smaller club that you'd say, what a pain in the ass playing them was. This was a misery. Do you remember?
Yeah,
I mean, you guys have
well, Martindale. I don't know if the answer is.
Well, I have another name in mind. I'm trying to push you for this other name.
Okay.
McInnes?
No,
not
he's not
McInnes.
Party almost every game.
Well,
I have no idea.
Jim Goodwin, probably. It's Mirren.
Steve Clark.
Right.
Remember those Kilmarnock teams? Right. So I went again when I wrote this article. Kilmarnock got a 0-0 draw against us and did not have a single shot. Okay. Playing anti-football, an abomination to the world. Right. And so there were games when they would counter and get have some luck and some variance. And, we blew them out. I think it was 4-0 one game that we destroyed them, or 5-0 that we got. But we're going to do that to teams of that size. So, that's why Livingston, I think, has been so much better than what the resources would suggest, is because they're embracing their challenge. They're not trying to play in a way that they're optimizing for chaos, and they create a lot of problems for people as a result. And I mean, they have a decent chance for making Europe in a league when you've got Hearts and Aberdeen and Hibs. That theoretically that should be a ridiculous notion. And this is not a one-off season that this is happening. Like, this is a formula that they've been executing on for over multiple seasons now. So again, they're a team. Out of the grand scope, I'd much rather play Ross County because they don't play this way for the most part against us. Like, they're a little bit more endeavoring, or Motherwell, or it's the St. Johnstons under Callum. It's Livingston under Martindale. These are the ones that I get worried that, if we have some bad luck on the day, that we're more likely to drop points than even playing Hibs or, Hearts to a large degree.
Mm-hmm. They are going a bit soft though. They had, sorry, Enda. They've actually. Can you believe this? They attempt the least number of crosses in the league. Like, that's astonishing.
Livingston.
Yeah, and they're nowhere near the team that plays the most long balls either this season. So that's quite interesting. And they're well under their expected goals against as well. So maybe a little bit of positive kind of variance that they've had this season. So I think I almost feel like the last two games we've played against them, especially away, we've been quite comfortable. So I'm not to take it lightly, because I agree with you. I think the next two home games, Johnson and really good Nick, actually, they've found since Nicky Clark's joined them, they've found a way to be really effective up front as well. He's a clever player. I'm not saying we should be afraid of Nicky Clark, but they found their mojo. I mean, St Johnstone have always been a stuffy team, right? And they found the mojo, and they're on a good. Their confidence is high. Livingston have only actually lost one of their last 6 league games, and that was to us, 3-0. They've been to Kilmarnock and won. They beat Aberdeen at home. They drew it away at Hearts as well. They got a draw, as we know, at Ibrox. They beat St Johnstone. So they're in good form. So this is going to be, I think it's going to be another sticky night. I'm a little bit concerned because, as I say, I get concerned when I start seeing 2 games in a row. And I know one game was a month ago, but the performance was actually pretty similar in terms of our kind of general stodginess and inability to break teams down. So, I hope we're a bit on it, because our creative players didn't have good days on Saturday. Matt O'Reilly to probably a slightly lesser extent, but certainly Jota was incredibly quiet for him. So Abada did a lot of good stuff, but he didn't. A lot of it wasn't accurate. I didn't mind that, because, as I say, I was just happy that he was dropping some bombs in there and creating a bit of noise and confusion. just what we needed. But so a little bit nervous, but we should be okay, I'm sure.
Yeah, I wasn't telling you to finish up there. I was talking about finishing up with your answer. So I didn't mean to cut across you there. This is our last podcast before Christmas, so a happy Christmas to everybody who is in the comments, who listens, who watches, who supports the podcast in any possible way.
Sorry, and that interrupt you. Somebody just popped in a question, I think, about penalties. Did you see that?
What is our penalty ratio of scored to miss?
Right. Oh. So I did an article on this, and I can't remember whether it was on my own site or the Celtic Way, so apologies, but I did do a piece on this. But so very quick answer is we're a little bit below where we should be over the last 5 years. I think we're something like, if you say industry standards like 79%, we're something like 74, whereas our opposition are at like 81. So again, that leads to a perception. So the numbers are actually not massively wide. It's not like we're down at 60% or so, like sort of penalty shootout type levels of missing, but we are below average and the opposition is slightly above average. So I think that does lead to a perception that probably we're not very good at it, but that can turn very quickly. I think Chris Commons was the best penalty I can remember in recent times.
I was just saying, given the sample size, I think if we score one more, we might move that back up.
Yeah,
we're not talking in huge volumes. Yep.
No, this is the problem with penalties. It's
yep.
They're very rare events in the scheme of things. Well, for us
especially
anyway.
if you're Celtic, not so much if you're Rangers. I think that's the best place to finish up on the pod. James Allen, happy Christmas. Hope you have
Merry Christmas,
a good
guys.
time off.
Everyone
We will
too.
be back with the pod. We won't be 3 weeks without a pod in the next couple of weeks. We will do a pod between the Livingston and the St. Johnson games and things like that. We'll try to arrange it over the Christmas period as well. So happy Christmas to everybody who has watched, listened, or got involved in the podcast in any way over the year. And thanks very much for listening to this one. And we'll chat to you next time. We'll chat later. Good luck.